November 7th, 1941. Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff Headquarters, Tokyo, Japan. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stared at the intelligence report, spread across his desk. The paper's edges crisp in the pre-dawn silence. The numbers seemed impossible, yet they came from Japan's most trusted source, the American Petroleum Institute's own published statistics. According to the analysis prepared by the Navy's research section, the United States possessed crude oil reserves totaling approximately 600 million barrels. Japan's entire war plan, the Southern Advance, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, the calculated gamble on American will, rested on this single assumption that America's oil supply was finite, vulnerable, and insufficient for a prolonged Pacific War. Onishi had spent 28 years in naval service, rising through intelligence and aviation commands. He understood logistics as well as tactics. The mathematics seemed sound. American crude production averaged 3.7 million barrels daily in 1941. At wartime consumption rates, those 600 million barrels of reserves would sustain perhaps 18 months of intensive operations before domestic shortages crippled American war-making capacity. The southern resource area would be secured by then, the defensive perimeter established. American resolve would crack when gasoline rationing bit deep into civilian life, when factories went dark for lack of fuel oil, when the reality of energy poverty made continued war unthinkable. What Nishi didn't know, what no Japanese naval strategist would comprehend until American tankers began crossing the Pacific in numbers that defied imagination, was that their fundamental assumption was wrong by an order of magnitude. The United States didn't possess 600 million barrels of crude oil reserves. It possessed over 1.1 billion barrels of proven reserves, with another 500 million barrels in probable reserves that American geologists hadn't bothered to certify because existing capacity already exceeded any conceivable demand. The miscalculation wasn't a rounding error. It was a civilizational blindness, an inability to comprehend a nation so geologically fortunate and industrially advanced that it treated petroleum abundance as a problem to be managed rather than a resource to be hoarded. The error originated in how Japanese intelligence interpreted American petroleum statistics. The research section of the Imperial Japanese Navy, headquartered in a nondescript building near the Navy Ministry in Kasumigaseki, employed 127 analysts dedicated to assessing American industrial capacity. Among them, Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Ome led a 14-person team focused exclusively on petroleum resources. They were not incompetent. Ome had studied at the Imperial University and spent 2 years analyzing American oil industry reports, trade publications, and government statistics. His team cross-referenced data from multiple sources: the American Petroleum Institute's annual statistical bulletins, Department of Interior reports, state-level production data from Texas and California, and quarterly earnings reports from Standard Oil of New Jersey, Texaco, and Gulf Oil. The problem lay not in their diligence, but in their conceptual framework. Japanese analysts understood oil reserves through the lens of Japanese geology, limited deposits requiring careful management, with known reserves representing essentially all available petroleum. When American sources reported proven reserves, Japanese intelligence interpreted this as total available oil, not realizing that American petroleum companies only certified reserves economically viable at current prices and technically accessible with existing drilling technology. Vast additional deposits remained uncertified not because they didn't exist, but because certifying them served no purpose when proven reserves already exceeded foreseeable demand by comfortable margins. Captured documents from the Naval General Staff, preserved in the National Diet Library's Modern Japanese Political History materials, reveal systematic underestimation. An October 1941 assessment titled American Petroleum Resources and War-Making Capacity concluded that American crude reserves totaled 586 million barrels based on American passes, Petroleum Institute data from December 1940. The report acknowledged uncertainty, noting that American classification systems differed from Japanese standards, but concluded that differences were likely minor. A margin of error of perhaps 10% seemed reasonable, meaning actual reserves might reach 650 million barrels at most. The analysis contained another fatal assumption, that American petroleum consumption would overwhelm domestic production within 2 years of intensive warfare. Japanese planners calculated that American military operations would require 8 million barrels monthly, while civilian consumption would demand another 100 million barrels monthly, even with rationing. Against this consumption of 108 million barrels monthly, American production of 111 million barrels monthly, 3.7 million daily, left little surplus for stockpiling. The 600 million barrel reserve would erode rapidly. By mid-1943, Japan's analysis suggested American operations would face petroleum constraints severe enough to force strategic choices, reduce naval operations, curtail air campaigns, or accept crippling civilian shortages. This assessment reached Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, in early November 1941. Nagano, a cautious strategist who had opposed war with America, found the petroleum analysis both disturbing and oddly reassuring. Disturbing because 600 million barrels still represented formidable reserves, requiring Japan to secure the southern resource area quickly. Reassuring because it suggested American staying power had limits. That time favored Japan if operations proceeded according to plan. The assessment became foundational to Japanese strategic planning, referenced in multiple documents justifying the decision for war. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp was that American petroleum geology bore no resemblance to Japanese assumptions. The East Texas field, discovered in 1930, contained an estimated 5.2 billion barrels of original oil in place. The Permian Basin of West Texas and southeastern New Mexico held reserves so vast that accurate estimation remained impossible with 1941 technology. Geologists understood only that petroleum deposits extended across thousands of square miles in multiple geological formations stacked vertically. California's fields from Ventura to Los Angeles County contained proven reserves exceeding 800 million barrels, with additional probable reserves in offshore deposits that existing technology couldn't yet access. Oklahoma, Louisiana, Wyoming, Kansas, every major oil-producing state possessed reserves that Japanese analysts, working from published statistics designed for investor information rather than military intelligence, systematically underestimated. While Japanese intelligence analysts struggled with incomplete understanding of American petroleum resources, the reality unfolding across the United States bore no resemblance to their calculations. The American petroleum industry in 1941 represented not merely an industrial sector, but a comprehensive system of resource extraction, processing, distribution, and innovation operating at scales Japanese planners couldn't conceive. The foundation was geological abundance. Proven crude oil reserves in the United States totaled 1.135 billion barrels as of December 31, 1940, according to American Petroleum Institute comprehensive surveys. This figure represented only petroleum deposits that had been discovered, delineated through drilling, and certified as economically recoverable using existing technology at current prices. It excluded probable reserves, deposits identified through geological surveys, but not yet proven through drilling, which added another 500 million barrels. It excluded possible reserves in unexplored areas where geological conditions suggested petroleum presence, but no surveys had been conducted. And it excluded the millions of barrels in small deposits that companies hadn't bothered to certify because existing proven reserves already exceeded any foreseeable demand. The scale of American petroleum operations in 1941 reflected this abundance. Daily crude production averaged 3.71 million barrels, produced from 392,272 active wells scattered across 21 states. Texas alone produced 1.28 million barrels daily from 138,754 wells, more than twice total Japanese oil consumption. California's 36,984 wells yielded 632,000 barrels daily. Oklahoma's 96,844 wells produced 467,000 barrels daily. Louisiana, Kansas, Illinois, Wyoming, New Mexico, Arkansas, Mississippi, Pennsylvania. The geography of American petroleum extended across a continental scale that made Japanese domestic production of 3,400 barrels daily, drawn from modest deposits in Niigata Prefecture and Akita Prefecture, seem almost quaint by comparison. But raw reserves and production capacity told only part of the story. The American petroleum industry had built an integrated infrastructure for processing, transporting, and distributing petroleum products that represented decades of capital investment and technical innovation. Refineries with combined capacity exceeding 5.3 million barrels daily processed crude into gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, lubricants, and hundreds of specialized products. The refining sector employed 117,000 workers across 379 facilities, ranging from massive integrated complexes like Standard Oil's Bayonne, New Jersey refinery, which processed 160,000 barrels daily, to smaller regional plants serving local markets. Transportation infrastructure moved petroleum with efficiency Japanese logistics officers would have deemed impossible. A network of pipelines extending over 94,000 miles connected oil fields to refineries to distribution centers, moving crude and refined products without requiring tanker trucks or rail cars. The Big Inch Pipeline, approved for construction in 1941, would eventually extend 1,254 miles from Longview, Texas to Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, capable of moving 300,000 barrels daily, more than total Japanese oil consumption. Tanker trucks numbered over 280,000 vehicles. Rail tank cars exceeded 180,000 units. Coastal tankers plied trade routes from Gulf Coast refineries to East Coast distribution terminals, moving products with casualness that reflected absolute confidence in supply security. This infrastructure existed to serve American petroleum consumption that dwarfed Japanese comprehension. Americans consumed approximately 1.3 billion barrels of petroleum products annually in 1941. More than twice the total proven reserves that Japanese intelligence attributed to American stocks. Gasoline consumption alone exceeded 570 million barrels annually, fueling 29.6 million registered automobiles, traveling 338 billion miles per year on increasingly sophisticated road networks. Industrial consumption, fuel oil for factories, diesel for locomotives, specialized products for manufacturing, added another 430 million barrels annually. Home heating oil, agricultural diesel, aviation gasoline, lubricants, asphalt for road construction, petroleum feedstocks for chemical manufacturing. American civilian petroleum use operated at scales that would have supported every military operation Japan contemplated with comfortable surplus remaining. The architects of this petroleum abundance were not military planners, but civilian entrepreneurs and engineers who had spent 4 decades transforming crude oil from a specialized industrial commodity into the foundation of American economic life. Men like Frank Phillips, who founded Phillips Petroleum in 1917 and built it into a vertically integrated company, producing, refining, and marketing petroleum products across the Midwest. William Stamps Farish, president of Standard Oil of New Jersey, who had overseen refinery innovations that increased gasoline yields from crude by 40% through catalytic cracking technology. Ernest Whitworth Marland, whose wildcatting in Oklahoma and Oklahoma's Burbank field discoveries in the 1920s had helped establish Oklahoma as a major producing state. These industrialists had built an industry predicated on continuous discovery of new reserves, constant improvement in extraction and refining efficiency, and aggressive expansion of petroleum consumption through marketing that convinced Americans to organize their lives around automobile transportation and petroleum-powered convenience. The technical capabilities undergirding American petroleum operations would have shocked Japanese analysts accustomed to manual drilling methods and simple refining processes. Rotary drilling technology permitted wells reaching depths exceeding 10,000 feet accessing petroleum deposits in geological formations Japanese drillers couldn't reach. Directional drilling techniques allowed multiple wells to access a single underground reservoir from different angles, maximizing extraction efficiency. Pressure maintenance through water flooding or gas injection extended reservoir life and increased ultimate recovery beyond what natural reservoir pressure alone would yield. Catalytic cracking at refineries broke heavy petroleum molecules into lighter, more valuable products, producing gasoline yields approaching 45% of crude input, compared to the 25% achieved through simple distillation. Behind these technical capabilities stood American petroleum engineering, a professional discipline that had evolved sophisticated understanding of reservoir dynamics, drilling techniques, and refining chemistry. The American Petroleum Institute, founded in 1919, had developed industry-wide standards for equipment, measurement, and practice that ensured compatibility across the entire petroleum supply chain. Universities including the University of Texas, University of Oklahoma, University of Pittsburgh, and Stanford offered petroleum engineering degrees, graduating hundreds of trained professionals annually who entered an industry hungry for technical talent. Professional organizations like the Society of Petroleum Engineers facilitated knowledge exchange, ensuring that innovations developed by one company rapidly spread throughout the industry. The organizational structure of American Petroleum reflected both competitive capitalism and pragmatic cooperation. Major integrated companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Texaco, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil of California, Shell, competed vigorously for market share while cooperating on infrastructure projects and industry standards. Independent producers numbered in the thousands, from substantial companies operating multiple fields to individual wildcatters drilling exploratory wells with borrowed capital. Service companies provided specialized expertise, drilling contractors, well logging services, seismic survey companies, pipeline construction firms, refinery engineering consultants. This ecosystem of competing firms and specialized services generated continuous innovation and operational efficiency that centrally planned industries struggled to match. The miscalculations' consequences became apparent not in a single dramatic moment, but through accumulating evidence that Japanese strategic assumptions bore no relation to American reality. The first shock came not from military operations, but from civilian consumption patterns that persisted despite war mobilization. April 15, 1942. German military attaché reports from Tokyo noted increasing Japanese concern about American petroleum rationing measures, or more precisely, the apparent absence of severe rationing. German intelligence, monitoring American newspapers and radio broadcasts, reported that American gasoline rationing, announced with great publicity, appeared primarily concerned with conserving rubber rather than petroleum. Pleasure driving restrictions seemed designed to reduce tire wear rather than petroleum consumption. American civilians still drove 29.6 million registered automobiles, albeit somewhat less frequently and at reduced speeds. No reports emerged of darkened American cities due to fuel oil shortages. No evidence suggested factory closures from lack of diesel or fuel oil. The American petroleum economy appeared to continue functioning at scales that made Japanese pre-war consumption seem insignificant. Japanese naval intelligence initially dismissed these reports as propaganda or German exaggeration, but intercepted American communications told the same story. In May 1942, Japanese cryptanalysts decoding U.S. military logistics communications noted references to petroleum stockpiling operations. Not emergency conservation measures, but deliberate accumulation of strategic reserves for future offensive operations. References to adequate supplies and sufficient stocks appeared in context, suggesting confidence rather than concern. Most puzzling were occasional references to petroleum storage capacity limitations, suggesting that American concerns focused on where to put surplus petroleum rather than how to stretch limited supplies. The scale of American naval operations provided harder evidence. By July 1942, Japanese naval intelligence had documented American carrier task force operations consuming fuel at rates that should have exhausted theoretical reserves within months if Japanese pre-war calculations were correct. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May, the Battle of Midway in June, continuous submarine operations, convoy, escort duties, amphibious operations support. American naval forces were operating as if petroleum supply imposed no constraint whatsoever. Japanese planners had assumed that American naval operations would face petroleum-driven limitations by mid-1943. Instead, American fleet operations were expanding, with new construction entering service and existing units maintaining operational tempos that suggested unlimited fuel availability. The Guadalcanal campaign that began in August 1942 demolished any remaining Japanese assumptions about American petroleum constraints. For 6 months, American forces sustained continuous naval operations, airstrikes, and logistical support for ground forces engaged in brutal jungle warfare. The petroleum consumed in supporting Guadalcanal operations, fuel oil for battleships and cruisers, aviation gasoline for carrier aircraft and land-based bombers, diesel for cargo vessels and landing craft, gasoline for trucks and construction equipment, would have exhausted the entire petroleum reserves that Japanese intelligence had attributed to American stocks if those calculations had been remotely accurate. By December 1942, Japanese analysts faced an impossible accounting problem. American military operations had consumed petroleum at rates exceeding 10 million barrels monthly for 6 months, totaling over 60 million barrels for military purposes alone. Civilian consumption, even with rationing, clearly continued at substantial levels. Intercepted communications and neutral shipping reports indicated no evidence of industrial paralysis or civilian hardship from petroleum shortages. If American reserves had totaled 600 million barrels at war's start, and consumption had exceeded 130 million barrels in the war's first year, remaining reserves should have fallen to approximately 470 million barrels. American operations should have been showing signs of petroleum constraint by early 1943. Instead, American operations were accelerating. Intelligence reports documented increasing numbers of new construction vessels entering service. Air operations were expanding both in frequency and in the number of units deployed. Logistical operations showed no signs of petroleum-driven limitations. Most damningly, intercepted communications occasionally reference petroleum surplus rather than shortage, with references to storage limitations and discussions of petroleum allocation priorities that suggested the problem was distributing abundance rather than rationing scarcity. The truth began penetrating Japanese strategic planning in painful increments throughout 1943. In March, Naval Intelligence revised its assessment of American petroleum reserves upward to approximately 850 million barrels, acknowledging that pre-war estimates had been incomplete. This revision came too late to alter strategic plans and still understated reality by 300 million barrels. By September 1943, as American forces advanced across the Pacific with logistical support that seemed to defy the laws of geography and supply, revised intelligence assessments placed American petroleum reserves at over 1 billion barrels, with the acknowledgement that precise figures remain uncertain due to American classification practices that differ significantly from every Japanese methodology. These revised numbers forced recognition of an uncomfortable reality. American petroleum abundance wasn't a temporary advantage to be overcome through Southern Resource Area development, but a permanent geological and industrial superiority that imposed fundamental limits on Japanese war-making capacity. Even if Japan successfully defended every captured oil field and maintained maximum production, even if American submarine warfare failed to interdict tanker traffic, even if Japanese synthetic fuel programs achieved their optimistic production targets, the petroleum available to Japanese forces would remain a fraction of American consumption. The strategic calculation that had justified war, that American petroleum vulnerabilities would create an opportunity for negotiated peace, rested on assumptions that had never matched reality. The scale of American petroleum operations during wartime transformed what Japanese planners had conceptualized as a strategic asset into an industrial system, operating at scales that defied comprehension through Japanese frames of reference. American military petroleum consumption reached 220 million barrels in 1942, rising to 380 million barrels in 1943, 540 million barrels in 1944, and 680 million barrels in 1945. These figures represented only military usage: Navy, Army, Army Air Forces, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and excluded civilian consumption that continued at approximately 1.1 billion barrels annually throughout the war despite rationing measures. Total American petroleum consumption during the war years, 1942 to 1945, exceeded 6.2 billion barrels, more than 5 times the total petroleum reserves that Japanese intelligence had attributed to American stocks in November 1941. This consumption was sustained by production that Japanese analysts had deemed impossible. American crude oil production increased from 1.353 billion barrels in 1941 to 1.677 billion barrels in 1945, a 24% increase achieved while simultaneously maintaining civilian consumption, building strategic reserves, and supporting Allied forces through Lend-Lease transfers. The production increase came from multiple sources: accelerated drilling campaigns that brought 32,481 new wells into production between 1942 and 1945, enhanced recovery techniques that extracted additional petroleum from existing reservoirs, and systematic development of fields that had been discovered but left partially developed during the Depression years when excess capacity made additional drilling uneconomical. The organizational efficiency behind this production expansion revealed American industrial capabilities that Japanese economic planners couldn't match. The Petroleum Administration for War, established on December 2, 1942, under Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, coordinated industry operations without nationalizing production. Private companies continued operating wells and refineries, but coordinated drilling priorities, allocated refined products, and shared technical information under PAW oversight. This hybrid system combined capitalist incentives with centralized planning, generating production increases and efficiency improvements that pure state control rarely achieved. Refining capacity expanded even more dramatically than crude production. American refineries processed 1.714 billion barrels in 1945, up from 1.421 billion barrels in 1941, a 21% increase achieved through multiple mechanisms. New construction added refining capacity, with 47 new refineries and substantial expansions at existing facilities, adding over 800,000 barrels daily of processing capacity between 1942 and 1945. Technical improvements increased yields of high-value products, with catalytic cracking installations increasing from 31 units processing 164,000 barrels daily in 1941 to 107 units processing 752,000 barrels daily in 1945. Aviation gasoline production, critical for air operations, increased from 40,000 barrels daily in 1941 to 514,000 barrels daily in 1945, a 13-fold increase in 4 years. Transportation infrastructure expanded to move petroleum from wells to refineries to consumption points with minimal logistical friction. Pipeline construction added 12,000 miles of new pipelines during the war, including the Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines connecting Texas to East Coast refineries. The Big Inch, completed in August 1943, moved crude oil at rates reaching 300,000 barrels daily, more than total Japanese crude production. The Little Big Inch, completed in March 1944, transported refined products at rates reaching 235,000 barrels daily. These pipelines freed rail tank cars and coastal tankers for other freight, illustrating how American logistics created capacity through infrastructure rather than accepting transportation as a constraint. The comparison to Japanese petroleum operations revealed a gap that military strategy couldn't bridge. Japanese crude production reached a wartime peak of 1.76 million barrels in 1943, produced primarily from oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and smaller deposits in Borneo and Sumatra. This represented Japan's maximum petroleum production, including all captured territories, less than half of what American forces consumed monthly by 1944. Japanese refining capacity totaled approximately 88,000 barrels daily in 1943, less than the processing capacity of Standard Oil's Bayonne refinery alone. Japanese pipeline infrastructure was essentially non-existent, requiring all petroleum transport via tankers, tank cars, and drums, methods that consumed petroleum in their own operation and imposed severe logistical burdens. The mathematics were devastating. In 1944, American forces consumed more petroleum in 3 days than Japan produced in a month. American military aviation fuel consumption exceeded total Japanese crude production by comfortable margins. The petroleum allocated to American logistics operations, trucks, construction equipment, generators, landing craft, exceeded total Japanese military consumption across all services. When American submarines began systematically destroying Japanese tankers in 1943 and 1944, they were interdicting a petroleum supply system operating at scales so modest that American planners struggled to comprehend how Japanese military operations functioned at all on such limited fuel availability. The industrial comparison extended beyond quantities to technical capabilities that amplified American advantages. American 100-octane aviation gasoline, produced through catalytic cracking and alkylation processes, provided aircraft engines with performance margins that Japanese engines using 87 to 92 octane fuel couldn't match. American lubricants, refined to precise specifications using advanced chemical processes, extended engine life and reduced maintenance requirements. American diesel fuel, standardized across the military through careful refining specifications, ensured compatibility and reliable performance in the thousands of different diesel engines powering landing craft, trucks, submarines, and auxiliary vessels. These technical advantages, invisible in raw consumption statistics, translated into operational superiority that compounded American numerical advantages. The realization that American petroleum abundance represented not a temporary advantage, but permanent geological and industrial superiority, created profound psychological effects on Japanese strategic planning and tactical operations. At the strategic level, recognition forced abandonment of fundamental assumptions that had justified the war. Japanese planning had assumed that American resolve would weaken as petroleum constraints imposed costs on civilian life and limited military operations. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was supposed to provide Japan with petroleum resources comparable to American reserves, creating strategic equilibrium. These assumptions collapsed as evidence accumulated that American petroleum operations faced no supply constraints, while Japanese operations struggled with severe shortages despite controlling the southern resource area's oil fields. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the Operations Bureau of the Naval General Staff in 1943 to 1944, later reflected in his memoirs on the psychological impact of this recognition. We had calculated that American petroleum reserves would prove insufficient for sustained operations at the tempo Americans maintained. By mid-1943, it became clear that our calculations were fundamentally wrong. American forces operated as if petroleum supply imposed no constraint whatsoever. This had profound effects on our strategic planning. We had assumed time favored Japan, that American operations would slow as petroleum supplies tightened. Instead, American operations accelerated, while our own forces faced increasing petroleum shortages despite holding the southern resource area. The tactical impact manifested in operational restrictions that progressively limited Japanese military effectiveness. Fuel shortages began constraining Japanese naval operations as early as mid-1943, forcing cancellation of training exercises and limiting fleet movements. By 1944, Combined Fleet Headquarters issued directives limiting fuel consumption for training to absolute minimums, resulting in Japanese pilots receiving dramatically less flying time than American counterparts. Japanese surface vessels faced fuel allocation decisions that forced choices between maintaining readiness at forward bases versus retaining strategic mobility for decisive battle. These constraints became self-reinforcing. Less training reduced effectiveness, requiring longer operations to achieve objectives, consuming more fuel and reducing future availability. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated how petroleum constraints influence tactical decisions with catastrophic results. Japanese naval forces approached the battle with inadequate fuel reserves, forcing Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa to plan operations that minimized fuel consumption rather than maximizing tactical effectiveness. Aircraft carriers launched strikes at extreme range to avoid closing with American forces, reducing attack effectiveness and increasing vulnerability to American fighters. Fleet movements prioritized fuel conservation over tactical flexibility. When American forces destroyed Japanese carrier air groups in what American aviators dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, fuel constraints limited Japanese ability to recover from losses. Replacement pilots received minimal training due to fuel rationing, perpetuating a spiral of declining effectiveness. The Leyte Gulf operation in October 1944 exposed petroleum constraints even more starkly. Japanese naval forces divided into multiple task forces, partly because fuel limitations prevented concentrating the entire fleet. The center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita entered battle with fuel reserves so limited that returning to base was uncertain, creating pressure to achieve decisive results in a single engagement. When Kurita withdrew after encountering unexpectedly strong American resistance, fuel constraints prevented him from maneuvering for a second attack. The entire operation reflected strategic planning distorted by petroleum scarcity that American forces never experienced. By 1945, petroleum shortages had become existential. Japanese aircraft sat grounded at airfields throughout the home islands, lacking fuel for operations. Remaining surface vessels stayed in port, preserving limited fuel for hypothetical final battles. Submarines curtailed operations. Training ceased entirely for most units. The kamikaze tactics adopted in the war's final year reflected not only desperation, but practical acknowledgement that conventional operations required fuel availability Japan no longer possessed. One-way missions required less fuel than conventional strikes with return flight capability, making suicide attacks economically rational under conditions of extreme petroleum scarcity. Intercepted communications from this period reveal the psychological burden petroleum constraints imposed. References to petroleum situation appeared in contexts, suggesting it dominated operational planning more than enemy capabilities. Requests for fuel allocations showed desperate prioritization, which units received fuel for operations versus which remained grounded. Officers' diaries and post-war interviews described demoralization as capable aircraft and vessels sat idle while American forces operated without visible constraint. The contrast between Japanese fuel poverty and American abundance became daily psychological reminder of the strategic situation's hopelessness. The comprehensive defeat of Japanese forces created opportunities for frank assessment that wartime requirements had precluded. Post-war interrogations, memoirs, and official histories acknowledged the petroleum miscalculation's centrality to Japan's strategic failure. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducting systematic interrogations of Japanese military and government officials between 1945 and 1947, documented extensive testimony regarding petroleum intelligence failures. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, interviewed in August 1945 before his suicide on August 16th, acknowledged, "Our assessment of American petroleum reserves was fundamentally incorrect. We believed American reserves totaled approximately 600 million barrels based on published statistics. We now understand American reserves exceeded 1.1 billion barrels, not including additional probable reserves. This miscalculation had profound consequences for strategic planning. We assumed American petroleum would prove insufficient for sustained operations. This assumption was completely wrong." Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet from May 1944 until war's end, testified in October 1945. The petroleum situation dominated operational planning from 1943 onward. We faced severe constraints while American forces operated without apparent limitation. This asymmetry affected every decision. Training was curtailed, fleet movements were restricted. Tactical plans prioritized fuel conservation over operational effectiveness. We understood by 1944 that American petroleum abundance represented permanent superiority that strategy could not overcome. Ratingly, Captain Toshikazu Ome, the intelligence officer whose 1941 analysis had estimated American reserves at 586 million barrels, provided detailed testimony regarding the analytical framework that produced the miscalculation. We interpreted American petroleum statistics using Japanese conceptual frameworks. We assumed proven reserves meant total available petroleum, as it would in Japan. We didn't understand that American petroleum companies certified only reserves economically viable at current prices. Vast additional petroleum existed that Americans hadn't bothered to certify, because existing proven reserves already exceeded any conceivable demand. This conceptual difference, treating petroleum as scarce resource requiring careful measurement versus treating petroleum as abundant resource requiring only partial accounting, reflected fundamentally different geological situations. We failed to grasp this difference. The Japanese Defense Agency's official history, published in the 1960s and 1970s, devoted extensive analysis to petroleum intelligence failures. Volume 8 of Senshi Sosho, the official war history series, concluded. The petroleum miscalculation represented not merely intelligence failure, but systemic inability to comprehend American industrial organization and geological fortune. Japanese intelligence analyzed American petroleum using Japanese frameworks and Japanese scales of reference. American petroleum operations exceeded these frameworks entirely. The result was strategic planning based on assumptions that bore no relation to reality, producing decisions that proved catastrophic. Individual testimonies from officers and officials added human dimension to statistical acknowledgement. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived the war, reflected in his 1952 memoir, "We thought we understood American capabilities. We had studied their statistics, analyzed their industrial reports, assessed their military potential, but we didn't grasp the scale. American abundance operated at dimensions that Japanese experience provided no framework for understanding. The petroleum was just one example, but it was perhaps the most important. We calculated we could outlast American resolve. We were wrong by orders of magnitude." Historian Saburo Ienaga, examining Japanese wartime decision-making in his controversial 1968 book, The Pacific War, argued that petroleum miscalculation reflected deeper problems in Japanese strategic culture. The failure to accurately assess American petroleum reserves stemmed from systematic biases that pervaded Japanese strategic planning. Japanese leaders assumed that Western nations, despite industrial advantages, faced resource constraints similar to Japan's. They couldn't conceive that geological fortune had provided America with petroleum abundance that eliminated the resource constraints that shaped Japanese strategic thinking. This failure of imagination produced decisions that doomed Japan from the war's outset. The recognition extended beyond official histories to personal reckonings. Numerous Japanese officers' memoirs published in the post-war decades acknowledged petroleum miscalculation as symptomatic of broader strategic delusions. These accounts shared common themes: initial confidence based on careful analysis, progressive realization that fundamental assumptions were wrong, ultimate recognition that American superiority reflected not merely greater resources, but different orders of magnitude that strategy couldn't overcome. The Japanese petroleum miscalculation offers enduring lessons about intelligence analysis, strategic planning, and the dangers of mirror imaging when assessing adversaries operating under fundamentally different conditions. The intelligence failure illustrated how analytical frameworks shape interpretation. Japanese analysts weren't incompetent or careless. They gathered extensive data, cross-referenced multiple sources, and applied rigorous analysis. But they interpreted American petroleum statistics using Japanese conceptual frameworks, assuming that American classification systems meant what Japanese systems would mean, that American petroleum accounting reflected Japanese attitudes toward resource scarcity. The error wasn't in data collection, but in the interpretive lens through which data was understood. Modern intelligence analysis recognizes this challenge through systematic attention to cultural and organizational differences in how information is categorized, reported, and valued. The petroleum miscalculation appears in intelligence training as a cautionary example of how technically accurate data can produce catastrophically wrong conclusions when interpreted without understanding the reporting entity's conceptual framework. American petroleum statistics were accurate. Proven reserves truly were approximately 600 million barrels in 1940. But proven reserves meant something fundamentally different in American petroleum accounting than Japanese analysts assumed, reflecting abundance rather than scarcity, partial certification rather than comprehensive accounting. The strategic impact demonstrated how single miscalculations can cascade through military planning to produce systematically wrong decisions at every level. Japanese petroleum assessments shaped naval construction priorities, favoring ships with exceptional range rather than firepower. They influenced training regimens, assuming American forces would face petroleum constraints requiring Japan to excel at close-quarters combat. They determined diplomatic strategies, calculating that American civilian hardship from petroleum rationing would create pressure for negotiated peace. Every level of planning incorporated the miscalculation, creating a strategic architecture built on a foundation that never existed. The contrast between Japanese petroleum poverty and American abundance illustrated broader patterns in how material resources shape military effectiveness. Petroleum wasn't merely fuel. It was freedom to train, to maneuver, to make mistakes and recover, to learn from combat and adapt tactics. American forces could afford operational inefficiency that would have crippled Japanese units. Fighter pilots could practice aerial combat until techniques became instinctive. Naval task forces could steam thousands of miles to avoid enemy concentrations or to achieve tactical surprise. Ground forces could deploy vehicles lavishly, using mechanical transport for tasks that other armies accomplished through animal or human portage. This freedom to use resources without constraint translated into qualitative advantages that statistics alone couldn't capture. Better trained pilots achieved higher kill ratios. More mobile ground forces exploited tactical opportunities faster. Naval forces with fuel to maneuver avoided ambushes and concentrated effectively. The quantitative advantage, more petroleum, produced qualitative superiority in combat effectiveness that compounded the raw numerical disparity. The post-war petroleum industry reflected lessons learned from wartime operations. American petroleum companies invested heavily in reserve estimation techniques, developing probabilistic methods for assessing undiscovered resources. International petroleum accounting standards emerged, attempting to create common frameworks for reserve classification to prevent the sort of categorical misunderstanding that had misled Japanese analysts. Geological surveying became more systematic and comprehensive, driven partly by military recognition that accurate resource assessment was a national security imperative. The strategic lessons shaped post-war American military planning. Petroleum security became explicit defense priority, with strategic petroleum reserves established to ensure supply continuity during potential conflicts. Military logistics planning incorporated petroleum consumption assumptions that dwarfed pre-war calculations, reflecting recognition that modern mechanized warfare consumed fuel at extraordinary rates. Alliance structures and overseas-based networks reflected partly the imperative of securing petroleum supply lines and strategic choke points through which petroleum flowed. For Japan, the petroleum miscalculation became emblematic of the gulf between wartime confidence and actual capabilities. Post-war Japanese strategic thought incorporated hard-learned recognition that modern industrial warfare requires material foundations that strategy and tactics cannot substitute for. The self-defense forces organized around acknowledgement of geographical constraints and resource limitations, adopting defensive postures that reflected realistic assessment rather than aspirational ambition. The story resonates beyond its specific historical context because it illustrates universal patterns in how organizations make catastrophic decisions. Competent analysts working with accurate data produced completely wrong conclusions because their interpretive frameworks didn't match the reality they were analyzing. Strategic planning built on these conclusions created a cascading series of decisions that seemed logical within flawed premises, but proved catastrophic when those premises collided with reality. The petroleum miscalculation also revealed how ideological commitments can blind analysis. Japanese strategic culture emphasized spirit, will, and determination as decisive factors in warfare. This cultural emphasis created subtle bias toward believing that American material advantages could be offset through Japanese superiority in morale and tactical skill. The petroleum assessment, while ostensibly objective, occurred within this cultural context. Analysts may have unconsciously accepted estimates suggesting American vulnerability because those estimates aligned with what Japanese strategic doctrine wanted to be true, that material advantages had limits, that will could triumph over resources, that careful planning could overcome industrial disparity. American petroleum abundance, conversely, reflected geological accident combined with institutional arrangements that encouraged exploitation. The United States possessed exceptional petroleum deposits through pure fortune of geography. No amount of Japanese innovation or determination could create equivalent reserves in the Japanese home islands. But geology alone didn't ensure abundance. American legal and economic institutions that permitted private mineral rights, encouraged risk-taking through potential rewards, and protected property rights created incentives for aggressive petroleum exploration and development. The result was an industry that discovered and developed petroleum resources at rates centrally planned economies rarely matched, generating abundance that became strategic asset without being designed as military resource. The final irony lay in how American petroleum abundance shaped the war's conclusion. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities, the naval blockade that strangled Japanese commerce, the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, all these operations consumed petroleum at rates that would have been unsustainable without American reserve depth. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima, and Nagasaki flew aboard B-29 bombers that consumed 6,800 gallons of aviation fuel each during missions, fuel that represented a trivial fraction of American daily production, but would have constituted significant allocation within Japanese petroleum budgets. Even the method of ending the war depended on petroleum abundance that Japanese miscalculation had dismissed as impossible. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi's November 1941 assumption that American petroleum reserves totaled approximately 600 million barrels seemed reasonable based on published statistics and careful analysis. The actual figure exceeded 1.1 billion barrels in proven reserves alone, with another 500 million barrels in probable reserves that Americans hadn't bothered to certify. The 500 million barrel gap between assumption and reality represented more than quantitative error. It represented the gulf between Japanese resource scarcity and American abundance, between careful husbanding of limited supplies and casual exploitation of geological fortune, between strategic planning premised on constraints and operations freed from supply limitations. This gap shaped every aspect of the Pacific War. Japanese forces fought with increasing desperation as petroleum shortages constrained training, limited operations, and forced tactical choices that sacrificed effectiveness for fuel conservation. American forces operated with freedom that petroleum abundance permitted, training intensively, maneuvering extensively, and accepting inefficiencies that petroleum-poor militaries couldn't afford. The contrast between constraint and abundance manifested in training quality, operational tempo, tactical flexibility, and ultimately in combat effectiveness that compounded American numerical advantages. The miscalculations lessons extend beyond petroleum to illuminate how intelligence failures occur, even among competent analysts, how strategic planning can build elaborate architectures on flawed foundations, and how material realities ultimately constrain what determination and skill can achieve. Japanese officers who planned the war weren't fools. They were professionals who analyzed carefully, calculated precisely, and concluded wrongly because their analytical frameworks couldn't comprehend a reality operating at scales that Japanese experience provided no reference for understanding. In the end, the petroleum miscalculation exemplified the central pattern of the Pacific War. Japanese strategy based on assumptions about American limitations, confronting American reality that recognized no such limitations. The 500 million barrel gap between what Japanese admirals calculated and what American reservoirs contained represented in miniature the broader chasm between Japanese aspiration and American capability, a gap that no amount of tactical skill, operational daring, or strategic cleverness could bridge, once revealed through the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare.